When Emily finally stepped out of her car and looked up at the little house that would soon be hers, a wave of relief washed over her. For months, she had been searching for the perfect place, a home that gave her space, freedom, and the feeling that life was finally hers to shape. The moment she saw this house, tucked just outside the neat cookie-cutter rows of the neighboring HOA community, she knew she had found it. No strict rules about paint colors, no mandatory landscaping, no endless newsletters about what she could or couldn't plant in her yard. Just freedom. The neighborhood itself was a contrast. To her left, manicured lawns stretched in perfect lines, white picket fences gleaming in the sunlight, and identical houses stood shoulder to shoulder, each one indistinguishable from the next. Children's bicycles were neatly parked in driveways, and every flower bed seemed to be a copy of the one across the street. But her house, sitting just outside the boundary of the HOA, felt like a rebel among the regimented. Its slightly crooked porch steps and wildflower garden in the front yard were proof of its independence. Emily couldn't help but smile at the thought. She stepped inside, unlocking the door with a satisfying click. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, and the floors creaked in a welcoming, honest way that made her feel at home immediately. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel constrained by someone else's rules or schedules. This was hers. Her excitement was contagious. Emily imagined her mornings sipping coffee on the porch, afternoons gardening without worrying about HOA inspections, and evenings hosting friends and family without receiving a single complaint about noise levels. She wandered from room to room, imagining furniture placement, color palettes, and the little touches that would make this house a home. Everything felt perfect, almost too perfect. And then she noticed movement outside. A woman, impeccably dressed and holding a clipboard, was striding purposefully down the street. She stopped, glanced at Emily's house, and then back at her clipboard, scribbling something with a sharp, precise motion. Emily didn't pay it much attention at first. Maybe a neighbor is checking out the new addition? But the woman's gaze didn't leave her for long. A frown appeared, then tightened, as if Emily had just broken some unwritten rule. And suddenly the clipboard was raised in what could only be described as a gesture of authority. Emily froze. There was something about the intensity of the woman's stare that made her stomach twist. This wasn't casual curiosity. This was judgment. Before Emily could react, the woman called out. "You can't live there." Emily blinked. Her first thought was confusion. "Excuse me?" she muttered to herself. Surely she misheard. "You heard me," the woman said, her voice sharp and loud enough to carry across the street. "You cannot live there. That house, well, it doesn't belong to you." Emily laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke or some bizarre neighborhood prank. But the woman wasn't laughing. She was pointing at Emily's house with such intensity that Emily could almost feel the heat from her glare. Emily's heart began to race. Who was this woman? And why did she suddenly seem so invested in the fact that Emily had bought this particular house? She didn't know yet that this was her first official encounter with Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of HOA rules next door, a woman who took the concept of neighborhood perfection to terrifyingly obsessive levels. For a moment, Emily considered ignoring her. After all, she wasn't part of the HOA, so technically Karen had no authority over her. But the woman's presence was overwhelming, and Emily sensed that this was just the beginning. The clipboard-wielding figure wasn't merely curious. She was preparing for a battle. Trying to keep calm, Emily took a deep breath and waved tentatively. "Hi, I'm Emily. I just moved in. Is there a problem?" The woman's eyes narrowed, and her mouth twisted into a sharp line. "Problem? Oh, there's a problem, all right. You can't just buy a house next to our community and think you can do whatever you want. You'll regret this." Emily's initial excitement wavered. She had imagined a peaceful, liberating life outside the HOA, but now she realized that the freedom she craved might come with unexpected challenges. She had no idea that the woman in front of her, the one who would soon become known as Karen, would make it her personal mission to monitor, police, and interfere with every single thing Emily did. But Emily also felt a spark of defiance. This was her home. No amount of yelling or intimidation could take that away. She squared her shoulders, smiled politely, and prepared herself. Whatever came next, she was determined not to be bullied out of the life she had finally fought to create. As she carried boxes into the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle for her peace had already begun. And from the expression on Karen's face as she retreated down the street, clipboard in hand, Emily knew this wouldn't be a quiet, simple neighborhood adjustment. This was going to be something much bigger, something she wasn't ready for, but would have to face head-on. Emily had barely finished unpacking a few boxes when the shrill sound of a car horn startled her. She glanced out the window and froze. There it was again, the same woman from earlier, striding down the street like a storm cloud on legs, her clipboard tucked under her arm. But this time she wasn't just watching. She was coming straight for her front door. The doorknob rattled sharply, and then a voice called out, loud enough for the entire street to hear, "Open up! We need to talk." Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to ignore it, chalking it up to neighborhood eccentricity. But another part knew she couldn't let this woman intimidate her from the very beginning. She opened the door, keeping her voice calm. "Hi, can I help you?" The woman's eyes narrowed into slits. "I'm Karen Whitmore, and you can't live here?" Emily blinked, momentarily speechless. "I beg your pardon?" Karen pointed her finger at Emily as if accusing her of the gravest crime imaginable. "You bought this house knowing full well it's outside our HOA. You can't just sneak in and think everything will be fine. This community has standards, rules, expectations, and you threaten them all." Emily felt a mix of disbelief and amusement. She had expected curiosity or a neighborly greeting, maybe a hesitant wave. She had not expected a declaration of war delivered like a legal indictment. "I didn't know there were standards I had to meet," she said, keeping her voice light, though inside her pulse was racing. "I just bought the house," Karen scoffed, flipping through her clipboard as if it contained the gospel truth. "Ignorance is no excuse. People like you, moving in without permission, outside the system, they ruin the neighborhood. And I will not allow it." Emily took a careful step back into her doorway, realizing that this woman, Karen, wasn't just a picky neighbor. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of rules and judgments that existed purely to intimidate anyone who dared deviate from the HOA mold. "Look," Emily said cautiously, "I'm not part of your HOA, and I don't intend to interfere with it. I just want to live here peacefully." Karen's face twisted in what could only be described as disbelief mixed with fury. "Peaceful?" she shouted. "You think you can just live here peacefully? You don't understand what you've done. You're a disruption, a threat to our order." Emily felt her chest tighten. The absurdity of the accusation made her want to laugh, but Karen's intensity was unnerving. There was no humor in those eyes, just the unshakable belief that she was enforcing justice, and Emily had broken the law of neighborly conformity. From somewhere down the street, a few HOA neighbors peeked through their blinds. Whispers carried across fences. Emily could feel their judgmental eyes, some curious, some amused, others seemingly on Karen's side. She realized in that moment that the neighborhood had its own ecosystem of approval and disapproval, and she had just wandered into a hornet's nest. Karen continued her tirade. "I've already spoken to the board. They're aware of you. You will face consequences if you don't leave. You cannot live here." Emily finally found her voice, steadier than she expected. "Karen, I understand you care about your community, but this house is legally mine, and I have every right to live here. I am not part of your HOA. I am not breaking any laws." Karen's eyes flashed with anger, as if Emily had personally insulted her very existence. "Laws? This is about morality, standards, the way things should be?" she shrieked. "You think just because you signed papers, you can destroy our harmony? You are selfish, reckless, and completely inappropriate." Emily's patience was tested, but she refused to let Karen see her panic. "I didn't come here to destroy anything," she said evenly. "I came here to live my life. That's all." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, her clipboard shaking slightly in her hands. She took a step closer, leaning over the threshold. I will not watch this neighborhood crumble. You will regret this decision. Mark my words." Then, without another word, Karen spun on her heel, marched down the street, and disappeared around the corner, leaving a faint trail of tension and disbelief behind her. Emily closed the door slowly, exhaling in relief. But the sense of unease didn't fade. Karen wasn't just a noisy neighbor. She was a symbol of what Emily was about to face, a relentless, obsessive presence that wouldn't let her freedom go unchallenged. Over the next few hours, Emily tried to unpack, organize, and settle in, but Karen's confrontation replayed in her mind. Every time she glanced at the neighboring houses, she felt those invisible lines of scrutiny stretching across the fences, measuring her, judging her, waiting for a mistake, and Emily knew, with a sinking certainty, that Karen would not stop here. She would find ways to interfere, to escalate, to make Emily's life uncomfortable, all because she had dared to live outside the system. Still, beneath the anxiety, a stubborn spark of defiance burned. Emily reminded herself, this was her home, her choice, her life. No one could force her out of a house she legally owned. And if Karen wanted a fight, well, Emily was ready to stand her ground. The calm before the storm was brief. Emily knew that Karen's obsession would only grow, and soon, the neighborhood would become a battleground for freedom, rules, and the unspoken power struggle that thrived just beyond the white picket fences. The first week in her new home was a mixture of excitement and tension. Emily had imagined unpacking boxes and slowly settling into her life, outside the rigid rules of the HOA. What she hadn't anticipated was that living just beyond its borders would place her directly in Karen's crosshairs. It began subtly at first. A flyer slipped under her door one morning, printed neatly in bold letters. "Neighborhood standards are important. Please respect the community." Emily raised an eyebrow. It wasn't addressed to her personally, but it was clear who it was meant for. She crumpled the paper, trying not to take it personally. The next day, a car drove slowly past her property, the driver glancing repeatedly in her direction. At first, she thought it was a coincidence, until a neighbor leaned over the fence and whispered, "Karen's out again. She's making rounds." Emily suppressed a sigh. This was beginning to feel like a full-time job she hadn't signed up for. Then came the first direct encounter after moving in. Emily had planted a small vegetable garden in her backyard, a modest patch of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. The next morning, Karen appeared at her back gate, peering over with a mix of horror and determination. "Do you know that planting a garden without HOA approval, well, hypothetically, if you were part of our HOA, would be unacceptable?" Karen demanded. Her tone left no room for negotiation. Emily stared, blinking. "I'm not part of the HOA, Karen. This is my property." Karen's frown deepened. "That doesn't matter. It sets a precedent. Others might follow your example. The neighborhood could descend into chaos, and I can't allow that." Emily couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. The absurdity of it was almost comical, chaos over tomatoes and basil. But Karen's intensity was frightening, not funny. She made it clear she was willing to escalate, enforce, and manipulate to ensure Emily would conform to nothing, technically. By the middle of the second week, Karen had begun using indirect tactics. Anonymous concerns about noise and landscaping appeared on Emily's doorstep, written in neat, precise handwriting. Neighbors she hadn't met waved awkwardly as she passed, some with smiles, others with subtle frowns, clearly influenced by Karen's efforts to sway public opinion. Emily tried to remain calm and rational. She documented everything, took photos of her yard, and double-checked that she was following local laws. She knew Karen had no legal authority over her property, but the emotional weight of constant scrutiny began to gnaw at her. One evening, while Emily was enjoying a cup of tea on her porch, she noticed Karen approaching again. This time, she had a small group of HOA neighbors in tow. They whispered to each other, casting glances at Emily's yard. Karen stopped at the edge of her property, arms crossed, clipboard in hand. "I've spoken to the board," Karen announced. "They're concerned about your presence here. They may take steps to ensure the neighborhood's integrity is preserved." Emily's hands tightened around her cup. Steps? What kind of steps? Karen's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. You'll find out soon enough. For now, just know that your choices are being watched, evaluated, judged. The group of neighbors shuffled uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact with Emily, others casting fleeting looks of support before looking away. Emily realized that Karen had slowly begun to manipulate the social atmosphere, turning curiosity into suspicion, whispers into mild intimidation. Despite the stress, Emily felt a quiet determination settling over her. She refused to allow Karen to dictate how she lived her life, even if it meant enduring daily confrontations and subtle sabotage. The tomatoes and peppers in her garden weren't just plants, they were symbols of her autonomy, her right to make decisions about her own home. Karen's escalation continued over the following weeks. She began calling local authorities under the guise of neighborhood concerns, insisting that Emily's home violated obscure, often irrelevant codes. She left notes on cars, complained about minor maintenance issues, and even attempted to rally other HOA residents to her cause. Every interaction was calculated, every word carefully chosen to intimidate. Emily, however, remained composed. She responded politely, legally, and strategically, never giving Karen the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Friends who visited commented on her calm demeanor, impressed by her ability to remain grounded despite the absurdity surrounding her. Late one afternoon, as Emily trimmed her garden, she overheard Karen speaking to another neighbor, her voice sharp and conspiratorial. She thinks she can just move here and do whatever she wants. We'll see about that. I won't let her ruin our standards. Emily straightened, gripping her pruning shears with quiet resolve. She realized then that Karen's obsession wasn't just about rules or aesthetics, it was about control. The more Emily resisted, the more Karen became determined to assert dominance. This wasn't going to be a simple neighborly disagreement. It was shaping up to be a full-blown war of wills. But Emily wasn't afraid. She had chosen this house for the freedom it offered, and she would defend that freedom with patience, strategy, and courage. Karen might scream, intimidate, and manipulate, but Emily had something Karen could never take away: her legal right to live in her home and her unwavering determination to do so on her own terms. As the sun set behind her backyard, Emily looked out over the small, flourishing garden. Despite the tension, she felt a small smile tug at her lips. This was the beginning. Not just of her life in this house, but of her stand against absurd control. And if Karen wanted a battle, Emily was ready to fight. With her calm, her patience, and her stubborn belief in her right to live freely. By the third week in her new home, Emily began to notice the subtle ways Karen's influence was spreading through the neighborhood. What had started as personal confrontations had grown into whispered conversations, sideways glances, and the occasional pointed remark. The once welcoming street now felt like a stage, with Emily unwillingly cast as the protagonist in Karen's drama. It began with small gestures. One morning, Emily noticed a neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, watering her flowers while sneaking peeks at Emily's yard. Later, Mrs. Callahan waved politely, but lingered just long enough to murmur, "You know, Karen says your garden isn't quite in line with the neighborhood." Emily smiled politely, but inside, she felt a flicker of irritation. The comment was harmless, yet it carried the weight of judgment. Another neighbor, Mr. Jacobs, who had previously been friendly and curious about the new house, suddenly avoided Emily entirely. He waved from his driveway but kept his distance, eyes darting toward Karen's house as if checking for approval before interacting with her. It was clear that Karen's influence had begun to divide the community, even in ways Emily could not control. Emily realized she was witnessing a subtle form of social warfare. Karen wasn't just yelling at her anymore. She was planting seeds of doubt, manipulating neighbors to see Emily as the intruder, the person who threatened the orderly rhythm of their lives. It was exhausting, invisible, and relentless. One afternoon, Emily's neighbor, Lisa, leaned over the fence to chat. Unlike Mrs. Callahan and Mr. Jacobs, Lisa seemed genuinely supportive. "Don't let her get to you," Lisa said softly. I know Karen likes to act like she's running the street, but most of us think she's overreacting. Emily felt a wave of relief. Finally, a small ally. But she also realized how fragile these alliances were. Karen had a knack for twisting perceptions and creating tension where none previously existed. Even those who quietly opposed her were hesitant to speak out too loudly, fearful of becoming her next target. The street, which had seemed uniform and predictable at first glance, was now a maze of unspoken rules, alliances, and tensions. Emily began noticing small changes. The way neighbors subtly positioned themselves to see her interactions, the hushed tones of conversation when she walked past, the fleeting looks of approval or disapproval that seemed to dictate who would speak and who would remain silent. Despite the stress, Emily refused to retreat. She continued tending her garden, arranging her furniture, and enjoying her freedom. Yet the weight of Karen's obsession and the neighborhood's divided loyalties began to press on her. The small acts of support, like Lisa's, were comforting, but they also reminded Emily how precarious her position was. Karen, for her part, seemed to thrive on this tension. She would patrol the street at odd hours, clipboard in hand, occasionally stopping to speak with neighbors, casting judgmental glances at Emily's property. Her presence was a constant reminder that the battle for the neighborhood's order was far from over. One evening, Emily overheard Karen talking to a cluster of neighbors by the mailbox. "She thinks she can come in here and change everything," Karen said, her voice carrying a mixture of fury and excitement. "We have to watch her, or the whole street will be ruined. Who knows what she'll do next?" Emily felt a pang of exasperation. It was incredible how Karen could twist reality, making her the villain simply for existing outside the HOA's rules. But instead of responding with anger, Emily made a conscious decision. She would let Karen expose her own obsession. The more extreme Karen became, the clearer it would be to the neighborhood that her behavior was irrational. Even as the divisions continued, Emily noticed subtle signs of quiet resistance. A neighbor who once avoided her now offered a friendly wave. Another, who had previously nodded in fear at Karen's statements, smiled when she passed by Emily's garden. These small gestures, almost imperceptible, suggested that not everyone had bought into Karen's narrative. Emily began to understand that the neighborhood wasn't a monolith. It was a complex web of personalities, fears, and loyalties. Karen had power because she acted loudly, decisively, and aggressively, but her influence had limits. And Emily, with her calm determination, patience, and commitment to her own life, was slowly carving out space for herself in the community. Even so, the tension was palpable. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered comment reminded Emily that Karen's watchful eyes were everywhere. The street had become a psychological battlefield, with Emily defending her autonomy, not with shouts or confrontations, but with quiet resilience. By the end of the 4th week, Emily realized that surviving this ordeal would require more than patience. She would need strategy, subtle alliances, and unwavering confidence. Karen's obsession might drive her to extremes, but Emily was determined to maintain control over her own life. Looking across the street at the perfectly manicured lawns and the ever-present Karen, Emily smiled to herself. She wasn't just a resident of this street. She was a quiet force of change, a reminder that freedom, patience, and integrity could endure even in the face of relentless scrutiny. The divisions in the neighborhood were real, but Emily knew one thing. Over time, rationality and fairness would prevail, and Karen's obsession would expose itself for what it truly was, an irrational quest for control in a world that refused to be controlled. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Emily finally encountered the full force of Karen's fury. She had been enjoying a cup of coffee on her front porch, the spring air carrying the scent of blooming flowers from her small garden. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the neighborhood tensions had subsided. Then she heard it, a sharp, commanding shout that sliced through the calm. "You cannot live here!" Emily looked up and froze. Karen stood at the edge of her lawn, arms akimbo, her clipboard pressed tightly to her chest. Her eyes were wide with fury, scanning every inch of Emily's property as if it were a crime scene. Emily rose slowly, placing her cup down and met Karen's gaze. "Karen, what is it now?" she asked evenly, striving to keep her voice calm. Karen took a step forward, pointing directly at Emily. "You think you can just move in here outside the HOA and do whatever you please? This street has rules, standards, traditions, and you are destroying everything!" Emily felt her pulse quicken but refused to back down. "Karen, I live legally in this house. I am not part of your HOA. I'm not breaking any laws or harming anyone. Please, just calm down." "Calm down?" Karen repeated incredulously, her voice rising even higher. "I've tolerated your presence for weeks, and now I see that you have no intention of respecting our community. You plant your garden however you like, you interact with neighbors without oversight, and you—" She paused dramatically, as if searching for the right words. "You have no concept of propriety." A few neighbors, drawn by the shouting, began to gather. Some peeked through blinds, others hovered cautiously behind fences, curious but hesitant to intervene. Emily noticed the subtle shift in their expressions. Some looked concerned, others bemused, and a few seemed quietly supportive of her. Emily took a deep breath. "Karen, I respect that you care about your neighborhood, but I am not part of it, and your idea of propriety does not apply to me. I am here to live my life peacefully, and I ask you to respect that." Karen's face twisted into a mask of disbelief and rage. "You think you can lecture me? You think your words mean anything? I am the protector of this street, and you—" She stomped her foot, causing a few of the bystanders to flinch. "You will regret this. I promise you, you will regret living here." Emily felt a surge of defiance. This was the moment she had anticipated, the peak of Karen's obsession. Instead of reacting with fear, she squared her shoulders and spoke with quiet authority. "Karen, I am not afraid of your threats. I will continue to live my life, tend my home, and enjoy my freedom. You may scream, intimidate, and complain, but none of it will change that. I will not be bullied." Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a fleeting moment, Emily thought she might retreat. But instead, Karen let out a shrill scream that echoed down the street, calling for the neighbors to witness her indignation. "How dare you?" she yelled. "How dare you flaunt your independence where it doesn't belong? You are selfish, reckless, and completely inappropriate." The tension was palpable. The air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the confrontation. Emily's heart raced, but her mind remained focused. She realized that Karen's theatrics were designed not just to intimidate her, but to assert dominance over the entire street. Her calm, measured response, however, undermined that performance. A few neighbors, emboldened by Emily's composure, began to speak quietly to each other, their expressions softening. It was subtle, but Emily could sense a shift, a recognition that Karen's fury was more about control than justice. Karen, sensing the change, grew more desperate. She waved her arms dramatically, her voice rising to a near scream. "I will not allow this. I am the guardian of our standards. You will pay for your insolence." Emily remained silent for a moment, letting the absurdity of Karen's claims settle over the gathering crowd. Then she said firmly, "Karen, your obsession has become your own burden. I have done nothing to harm this street or its residents. It is time for you to accept that I belong here just as much as anyone else." For a brief, tense moment, Karen's fury seemed to falter. Her eyes darted around, searching the crowd for support. But the subtle expressions of doubt and quiet solidarity were unmistakable. Without another word, she turned sharply, grabbed her clipboard, and stormed back toward her house, leaving behind a silence heavy with tension and anticipation. Emily exhaled slowly, her body relaxing for the first time that afternoon. She knew this confrontation was only one chapter in the ongoing saga, but she also realized something important. Karen's power was rooted in fear, intimidation, and drama. By refusing to react with fear or anger, Emily had begun to chip away at that power. As she returned to her porch and her cup of now cold coffee, Emily reflected on the confrontation. It had been exhausting, emotionally draining, and even a little frightening. Yet beneath it all, she felt a sense of satisfaction. She had stood her ground, maintained her dignity, and refused to be intimidated by an obsession that had no real foundation. The neighborhood had witnessed the showdown, and Emily sensed the shift. Karen might scream, manipulate, and control, but her influence was not absolute. The balance was beginning to tip, quietly, subtly, in Emily's favor. For the first time, Emily allowed herself a small smile. The battle wasn't over, but she had proven to Karen, to the neighbors, and most importantly to herself, that she would not be driven out of her own home. The confrontation had been dramatic, yes, but it had also been empowering. Emily knew that, moving forward, she could face Karen's next move with confidence, patience, and an unshakable sense of justice. After weeks of tension, whispers, and confrontation, Emily began to realize that Karen's obsession, while loud and dramatic, had limits. The turning point came unexpectedly one Saturday morning. Emily had spent the early hours tending her garden, pruning roses, and watering her small vegetable patch when she noticed a neighbor standing hesitantly by the sidewalk. It was Lisa, the kind neighbor who had quietly supported Emily from the beginning. "Emily," she said softly, "some of us, well, we think Karen has gone too far. We want you to know you're not alone." Emily felt a surge of relief. It was more than just support, it was validation. Karen had controlled the narrative for so long, convincing some neighbors that Emily was the disruptor. But now that narrative was beginning to crumble. Small acts of solidarity were forming, and Emily sensed a subtle shift in the neighborhood dynamic. Emboldened, Emily decided to take a proactive approach. She began inviting neighbors over, coffee on her porch, casual chats in the yard, friendly questions about plants or local services. At first, some were cautious, nervous about Karen's reactions. But as they spent time with Emily, they realized that she was approachable, kind, and respectful. Her presence was not a threat. It was simply her life, lived peacefully. Meanwhile, Karen's attempts at intimidation started to backfire. Her constant complaints and dramatic confrontations had begun to alienate neighbors who had once been neutral or mildly curious. People started noticing the absurdity of her obsession, her exaggerated claims, her relentless surveillance, and her inability to accept that Emily had a legal right to her property. One afternoon, as Emily trimmed her rose bushes, she overheard Karen talking loudly to another neighbor. "We have to do something," she shrieked. "She thinks she can just live here without consequences. This will set a precedent." Emily paused, quietly observing. Karen's voice was sharp, but there was a tremor, a hint of desperation that hadn't been there before. The neighbors listening exchanged uneasy glances, some quietly shaking their heads, realizing Karen's crusade was becoming excessive. Emily continued with her gardening, calm and composed. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Karen's obsession was isolating her, while Emily's patience, consistency, and kindness were building quiet alliances. By simply living her life respectfully, Emily was turning the tables. Over the next few weeks, subtle but significant changes occurred. Neighbors who had avoided Emily now greeted her warmly. Some offered small gestures of support, a wave, a smile, or an invitation to a casual neighborhood gathering. Others, who had once whispered concerns, now joined her for friendly conversations on the sidewalk. Emily could sense Karen's frustration growing, her influence waning with every act of neighborly camaraderie that Emily quietly nurtured. Then came the moment of vindication. One morning, a small group of neighbors approached Emily, smiling and nodding. "We wanted to say, 'We support you,'" one said. "Karen's been extreme, but we see how kind and respectful you are. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Emily felt a wave of gratitude and relief. The balance had shifted. Karen's dramatic confrontations no longer intimidated the neighborhood. Emily's calm determination had transformed the perception of her presence, turning suspicion into acceptance and fear into respect. Even Karen's attempts at escalation, calls, complaints, and dramatic gestures began to lose power. The more she tried to manipulate and control, the more obvious her obsession became to everyone around her. Her authority, which had once seemed absolute, was crumbling under the weight of her own extremism. Emily, for her part, continued living her life with dignity and composure. She tended her garden, hosted small gatherings, and maintained friendly interactions with neighbors. Karen's outbursts became increasingly isolated events, observed by a community that no longer gave them weight. Emily had not only defended her home, but had also quietly reclaimed control over the social dynamics of the street. The final moment came one crisp morning when Emily looked across the street at Karen, who was pacing and gesturing dramatically in front of her own house. Emily smiled to herself, sipping coffee on her porch. Karen's energy had shifted from authority to frustration. She was no longer a figure of control, but of obsession, visible for all to see. Emily realized the lesson of the past weeks: patience. Resilience and strategic calm could overcome even the loudest, most irrational opposition. By refusing to engage in fear or anger, by living respectfully and assertively, she had transformed a situation that could have been exhausting into one of quiet empowerment. She looked around at the neighbors now waving, smiling, or casually chatting. The street was no longer divided. The subtle tensions had eased, and Emily's presence had become accepted, even appreciated. Karen's attempts to dominate had only highlighted the absurdity of extreme control, reinforcing Emily's position as both a legal resident and a respected member of the community. Sitting back on her porch, Emily took a deep breath, enjoying the calm that she had fought to achieve. The battle had been intense, exhausting, and sometimes surreal. But in the end, freedom, patience, and integrity had won. For the first time since moving in, Emily truly felt at home. She had not only defended her property, but had also navigated the intricate web of social dynamics, exposing obsession for what it was and quietly cultivating respect, friendship, and autonomy. The street remained lively, the gardens blooming, and the neighborhood functioning as it always had, but with one difference. Emily had asserted her right to live freely, and nothing, not even the most dramatic HOA crusader, could take that away. The neighborhood had returned to a semblance of calm. Lawns were trimmed, flowers bloomed, and the quiet hum of everyday life replaced the tension that had once gripped the street. Emily sat on her porch one late afternoon, the sun casting a warm glow over her small garden, and reflected on the whirlwind of the past several weeks. It had been a battle unlike anything she had anticipated. From the moment Karen first appeared, clipboard in hand, shouting that she couldn't live there, Emily had been thrust into a struggle that was as much about social dynamics and human obsession as it was about property or HOA rules. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, had become the center of a neighborhood drama, a stage on which Emily's resolve was tested daily. Looking back, Emily realized that Karen's actions, while exhausting, had also revealed something essential about human behavior. Karen wasn't merely a demanding neighbor. She was someone obsessed with control, with rules, with maintaining a sense of superiority. Her loud proclamations, her dramatic confrontations, and her relentless attempts to intimidate Emily had all stemmed from a deep need to assert dominance over a world that, in reality, refused to be controlled. But Emily had learned her own lessons as well. She had discovered the power of patience, the strength of maintaining composure under pressure, and the quiet authority of living one's life with dignity. By refusing to react with fear or anger, she had gradually shifted the balance of influence in her favor. Her calm consistency had revealed the irrationality of Karen's obsession, while quietly building alliances and earning respect from neighbors who had once been uncertain or even wary. The street itself had become a mirror of this transformation. Where there had once been whispers and judgment, there was now subtle camaraderie, friendly waves, and the occasional casual chat. Emily's presence, initially perceived as disruptive, had become a symbol of resilience and rationality. By simply being herself, living her life, tending her garden, and engaging respectfully, she had reshaped the neighborhood's perception and undermined the power of irrational control. Even Karen remained a fixture in the neighborhood, her energy still high, her complaints still audible to those who happened to hear. But her influence had waned. The dramatic confrontations that had once terrified and intimidated the street now seemed isolated, almost theatrical, observed with a mixture of bemusement and quiet tolerance. Emily understood that obsession, when unchecked, often isolates those who wield it, leaving them alone with their own intensity while the world continues around them. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, Emily realized that the experience had been about more than just living outside an HOA. It had been a lesson in human nature, in boundaries, and in the subtle but profound power of composure. Karen's explosions, threats, and surveillance had tested her patience, but they had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate the strength of quiet determination and integrity. Emily looked out over her garden, a small victory in itself. Each blooming flower, each thriving vegetable, represented not just a well-tended plot of land, but a symbol of autonomy and resilience. In many ways, the garden had been a battlefield, a place where control had been contested and won, not through confrontation but through steadfast care and attention. And the neighborhood, too, had shifted. The whispers of judgment were replaced by small gestures of acknowledgement, subtle signs that reason and fairness could overcome obsession and intimidation. Emily felt a sense of fulfillment, not just for herself, but for the subtle victory of autonomy and common sense over irrational control. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Emily allowed herself a small, contemplative smile. Karen's obsession had revealed the dangers of excessive control, the futility of attempting to dominate lives that were legally and morally independent. At the same time, Emily had discovered the quiet power of standing one's ground, cultivating support and responding with patience and respect rather than escalating conflict. In that moment, Emily pondered a question that had emerged naturally from the ordeal. When does caring for a community cross the line into controlling it? At what point does vigilance become obsession? And at what cost to both the obsessed and those caught in the crossfire? Emily didn't need a definitive answer. She knew that she had navigated the situation successfully, preserving her autonomy, cultivating respect, and quietly dismantling the fear that had once loomed over her. But she also recognized that the questions themselves were important, questions that challenged assumptions, illuminated boundaries, and encouraged reflection on the delicate balance between community and control. As the sky deepened into twilight, Emily took a deep breath and whispered to herself, almost as if speaking to the neighborhood as a whole. Freedom isn't just about owning property. It's about living with dignity, patience, and integrity, even when others try to take it from you. And with that, she returned to her garden, to her home, to her life, undaunted, empowered, and fully aware that she had not only survived, but had also turned an obsessive confrontation into an opportunity for growth, reflection, and quiet triumph.